DN members, Giselle Garcia, Catriona Craig, and Emma Dorfman. Some of them are here, some of them are not. And we kind of came up with this idea together, and they were very instrumental in putting this together for us. So I will officially start now. I'm Sarah Sigal. I'll be chairing the event. I am a DN board member, writer, dramaturg, working across theater, film, and fiction. I've worked a little bit in environmental and immersive theater, and I'm really excited to talk about all these things. We have three wonderful speakers across different countries and time zones. We have Chantal, and please correct me if I did study French for many years, but please correct me if this is not correct. Bilodeau.
Yes.
Okay, Bilodeau, yeah. Who is originally from Canada and now New York based, is that correct? Yes. Now based in New York, she is a playwright and translator whose work focuses on the intersection of storytelling and climate change. She is the founding artistic director of the Arts and Climate Initiative. Next up, we have Kas Darley, who is based in the UK. Are you in London right now?
I'm not. I'm in Dorset by the seaside.
Dorset, which for those of you who don't know, is in the southwest of England. Kat is an actor and joint artistic director of immersive theater specialist Teatro Vivo, UK company. And finally, we have Lynde Rosario, who is based in, is it Minnesota? Are you
currently in Minnesota? Yes.
Minnesota, okay, in Minnesota. She's a dramaturg and the director of the fellowship programs at Playwrights Center. She is also the impact assessment director for the National New Play Network and president of LMDA. So thank you all for coming. I am going to start with what I think and hope will be kind of a basic question, and I think everyone can just pitch in when and how you would like to. I'm not going to, be like, you know about this, and I'm just to respond how you like. What role can and does in your work landscape play dramaturgically in environmental and site-specific and site-responsive performance? So let's talk about the role of dramaturgy in the work that you guys have made and are making.
Whoever wants to go first. Today. I will, if no one else wants to. Hello. So I guess for Teatro Vivo, we always make work that's not in theatres, and the majority of the time, at least part of each show is outside. Quite a lot of the shows are entirely outdoors. We've started off making work in very urban spaces, so sort of grotty bits of London, basically, that people didn't usually get to see. And then I moved to the West Country, and now we're sort of juggling between making work in those very urban places, but also some extremely beautiful rural and coastal places. But actually what stayed the same is the way we view the environment and the landscape in the work that we make, which is that it's essentially an extra collaborator. We never try and cover it up. We never try and change it. We never try and add things or set dress or make it into something it's not. We use what's there, and we try and find the magic of what's there, and often those spaces therefore really affect the narrative and the dramaturgy, and the dramaturgy affects it. If you see what I mean, it feels like it's a very collaborative relationship, and that the environment and the space becomes an extra collaborator in the work that we're devising together. If that makes sense.
I love this idea of the environment as the extra collaborator. That's lovely.
I have done a little bit of work outside, but also I'm a playwright, so I have written plays where landscape is a character, is a very big presence. A lot of the plays that I write are set in various countries in the Arctic, and the Arctic has such a huge, the landscape has such a huge, overwhelming presence that in order to really capture what the Arctic is in a story, I feel like I need to make the environment more than just the backdrop, but actually have it, whether it is speaking or not, have it an integral part of the story.
That's interesting. We've actually had the landscape speaking quite a few times as well. When you start thinking about it, it needs a voice sometimes, I think.
Yeah, and giving it agency.
Yeah. and having opinions about what humans are doing on it.
Yes.
With it.
That's so fascinating. And I'll just jump in to add that in the ensemble work that I've been doing as a dramaturg, working with landscape over many centuries or over long periods of time, we used a number of different tools, not just research to look back on sort of how the landscape has evolved and changed over many years, but to predict based on evidence how the landscape will be in many years from now. There was this incredible app that we used to determine the water level on the island of Manhattan and in the year 2050. And you could just hold your phone up and it would actually show you in real time where the water would be. And it just became this incredible journey, not just in discovering what this devised piece we would all put together would be, but to just understand that at a certain point, the water level and the landscape around you dictates how you move, how you see the world, what resources you have available. Like everything about your life is then affected by the landscape in which you must traverse and navigate. And I think it was so eye-opening for us to all dig into sort of the dramaturgy of this evolution and of a changing landscape in one location over a long period of time. And so that was just fascinating to see how in relationship, this character of the landscape really had an impact and affected every one of us.
Yeah. I feel like it goes both ways as well, as well as looking at the future, which is really interesting, especially with everything that's going on at the moment, really vital, I think. Where I am at the moment, it's really easy to start sort of digging into the past. We have these network of paths called the holloways, because the land here is very it's sandstone, so it erodes very, very easily, and the holloways are paths that have been walked for hundreds and sometimes thousands of years, and they've eroded, so they're quite narrow, quite steep paths with sort of big banks on either side. And every time I walk one, I think about, you know, who trod on them in order to make that erosion happen down into the ground. And I'm absolutely, we're still trying to figure out how to make a show that you can fit all, because they're so narrow. It's really hard to make a show there. But it's on our list of something to do to sort of, you know, really dig into those paths and what footsteps they held.
This idea of, oops, sorry, I've interrupted somebody. I was just briefly going to say this idea of landscape suggesting dramaturgical pathways is really interesting, and changing landscape suggesting dramaturgy is a fascinating thing. Sorry, Chantal, is it? Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I've been thinking about landscapes in the fall. This past fall, I drove across the country, like both ways, leaving from New York and going all the way to British Columbia and Canada, and then back again. And it was really interesting to see the landscape change, how one landscape becomes another, and what the transitions it has to go through to go from plains to mountains or the other way around. And the cultures that are associated with that. You know, I saw most of it just from the road, from the highway, but still it was very tangible. And I felt that there was something to learn from these transitions, as opposed to just being dropped into a landscape. You know, usually you fly somewhere, you drop and you're like, oh, this is beautiful. You know, I can get a sense of this, but I think I felt like I could get a little bit of a sense of the history and how people's lives change just from going from one landscape to another. And I don't know how that translates dramaturgically, but I've been thinking about it, and I feel there's something significant there.
I do kind of have a question that sort of links to this idea of making work that travels, or you were traveling through the landscape, and maybe there's a sort of possibility of movement, and there's a sort of dramaturgy in that. But what's the sort of, like, what are some possibilities for dramaturgy and performance in like non-building based spaces, whether it's purpose built for theater or not, versus being out in the world? Like, what are the kind of differences in the work that you've made? What have you found?
I mean, in terms of making work that isn't in theatre spaces, I feel like it really helps to make the work in the space, because you can say, oh yeah, we're going to do this in this up a hill or by a stream or whatever, but until you're there, you can't really see what the possibilities are, or where the characters might put themselves, or how that might affect the way they interact. And my experience of working with actors in those spaces is that it's just joyous, because everybody is constantly looking for the best and most interesting and most exciting place to be. Where can I put myself that will be really surprising to the audience and really good fun and really shake things up and change people's perspectives, or show them something they've not seen before. So I mean, I think it's important when we talk about landscape and environment that we're not just talking about pretty outdoor natural environments, because urban built up areas can have as much interest, if not more, especially when you throw in random people who aren't necessarily part of the action but become part of it just by being present. And especially in cities, I think it can be really lovely to draw people's eye to things that they haven't seen before, or in their local area that they've just never noticed because they've walked past them every day. And then when you make that place part of a story, then it brings this sort of magic to it. And we have people saying to us all the time, every time I walk past this spot now, I think of whatever scene it was that they saw there. And it sort of opens people's eyes to where they live and things that might not have felt very special or magical, and changes their opinion in a way that I think is really great. Much more interesting than a black box. Anyway.
Yeah, I'll say that it's always surprised me to see audience members experiencing work in spaces that are not the theater space that they would assume a theater thing happens inside of. And I think that it allows artists to meet audiences as they are and where they are in a way that could do a number of different things. And in my experience, it has been most fascinating when the piece itself is challenging a very obvious way that someone has chosen to exist in the world. The most basic that I can think of just from a project I had done was a piece that was condemning the use of plastic straws. And an audience member very clearly was using a plastic straw that they had just walked up. And it was just a natural part of their habit in their day. And in that moment, I got to observe how that piece of work challenged this person's daily routine in a way that it felt almost enlightening. Mm-hmm. It was unexpected for that audience member, clearly, but they had an impact that they walked away with that maybe they hadn't, because when was the last time you were allowed to even walk into a traditional theater space with a beverage and a straw? So I think even just being able to meet audience members where they are and having them you as they are, and not in a more performative space, not where they are also performing audience member for a group of people, you automatically have diffused a power dynamic that I think allows us to see each other more freely as humans and less as performer and performed for. And what does that do? I think it does create a more immersive experience that may potentially alter someone's daily routine or behavior that I think, Kas, you're right, is very exciting. It can be very unexpected, but also very exciting.
I think, I don't know if this translates very well to America, actually, but obviously in the UK, we're still ridiculously class-bound in a lot of ways. And theatre is not always, but is often the preserves of the middle class a bit. And a lot of the places that Teatro Vivo certainly started performing and still perform quite regularly is Lewisham in southeast London, which is not a particularly, but it's quite a deprived area. A lot of people there are not necessarily people who would go to the theatre. You'd really struggle to get into the doors of a building, maybe. But actually, interestingly, in my experience, have been much more accepting of finding work on their streets and just joining in with it and being part of it. And being like, whoa, this is weird and fun, but great, it's happening on my street, wonderful. It's a bigger stretch, oddly, for people who are used to going into black box theatres to accept that you're doing some performance not in the way that they're expecting that to happen. But again, that's about, for me, the interesting thing is about that is that we're then able to reach people that would never come through the doors of a building. And whether that's a show, you know, we made a show about really the politics of environmentalism and what we want, what people want politicians here to do. And that was really great to be able to get the opinions of people who, you know, are just not part of that debate normally, because that's certainly in the UK, again, the climate crisis has become quite, there's a lot of sort of very middle class voices in that debate and really not very many people from more diverse communities. Or just something that's really super fun, you know, and giving people a chance to play in a way that might not be something that they can usually either afford to do or take time out their days to do. But if it's in a surprising environment or an unusual landscape, or, you know, round the corner from their house or in their workplace or whatever it is, it gives people that opportunity who might not normally have it, which I think is great. It's really one of the things that's most pleasurable about doing it for me.
These conversations are bringing up so many. Sorry, Chantal, I keep cutting you off. I'm so sorry. Please speak, and then I will speak.
Thank you.
The polite Canadian getting run over by.
Sorry.
In 2021, we did a show outdoors in Central Park in New York City, and it was actually due to the pandemic, because when we started conceiving of the show, we didn't know if we were going to be able to be indoors or outdoors. And so just to be safe, we thought, oh, we'll do this show outdoors. And it was actually the first time we were doing this. And and I laugh at myself because I'm like, oh, why didn't I think of this before? You know, if you're going to talk about the environment, it's so much more powerful if you're in the environment. And just like you said, Kas, we had people, you know, Central Park, everybody's been there. We were in a corner of the park that maybe some people are not used to, but we had a lot of comments about how people were seeing the park in a new way, how they were noticing things they had never noticed before, how amazing it was to, the way we did it, it was a guided walk, and then sort of on the main path, and then we found little nooks that were a little bit hidden, and we would take people there and they would see a performance, and then we'd go back on the main path and see another performance. So it was a little bit like a surprise, you know. They would find these little nooks in the park that they wouldn't go to normally, that kind of functions as theaters, because a lot of them were round and they were surrounded by trees and foliage, and, you know, there was a little bit of they were isolated, and so we could hear a little better if there was a lot of noise around us. And to this day, people will comment on how amazing it was to be able to think about all the things that these performances brought up as they were in the environment itself.
One of my questions, and this kind of keeps coming up, is for those of you who have worked both whether you've worked both in rural and urban areas, or you've more worked in one than the other, just maybe we could talk a bit about the differences and the similarities between working in an urban environment and making performance for rural or more rural environments, and how that impacts the performance and the dramaturgy.
I have not worked in rural areas, so I can only speak about the very, very urban. And
please do.
Yeah. So again, Central Park, the thing that was amazing is that it was ticketed, but we also welcomed anybody who would just pass by and was wondering what was going on. So it was amazing to have access to so many people, you know, being able to draw people who would not normally, like Kas said, maybe not normally go to the theater, and to be able to invite them informally, so they didn't have to commit. It's not like I'm going to buy a ticket and go sit in this black box and I'm committing, you know, to be there for an hour and a half or 2 hours. In this case, they could just drop by, listen for a little bit, and then move on with their day. And we were super lucky to have one of the last beautiful days of the summer. The event was in September, so I don't think I would be able to speak about it as rapturously if it had been raining, because it was only this one day. We had only one date, but everything functioned in our favor. And the ending where the walk ended was around this big, beautiful tree with the views of the buildings in the background, you know, all the high rise around the park. And so we had a mix of this very natural built but natural environment and the city in the background. And I think that the superposition of both is also an interesting way to think about climate and environment, because so many of our spaces are urban and so many people don't have access to the nature, as in either rural or wild. And so what they know is the green spaces in urban environments.
Yeah, I have totally found that to be the truth for any time I've worked in really urban areas, sort of that idea that you are established as a space and people operate around you, as opposed to sort of you traveling to each, or even asking the audience to like continually find you in other spaces. But I that's been the biggest difference, at least I have seen, in working in both. When I did a piece in Manhattan, it was very much about like timed performance. Like, these are the times we are going to be in this space, and anyone who passes by at that time would experience the space. Whereas I found that in Colorado, there were just less people than in Manhattan. And so when we were deciding on how folks might experience or travel through an outdoor space, it had a lot more breathing room. And we were able to say, like, well, what if we break them up into groups? What if one group has this type of experience and navigates a space this way, but we have enough space and as few people to navigate another group this way, and they might never even intersect with each other. And, you know, but there's just really, with the denseness and mass of major cities, it feels daunting to create that type of transitory experience. Whereas I found in rural spaces, that was very accomplishable in a way that I found that just the breadth and depth of space, like the width of all of the space and the lessening of the amount of people that you would have to control in any one moment. I would also say that something that really shocked me about both of those experiences was they tended to be intergenerational. I'll speak for myself, when I have found that those open spaces are just very accessible to the public, that people are out with their children, and all of a sudden you're now, and I think because of that awareness, both groups that I was working with created at least a lens at which to view the piece from a child's eye, or a young person's storyline was embedded somehow into each of those narratives in a way that felt like we weren't going to ignore the fact that children would pass by us, and that we would have to find a way to engage on all levels with all people. And so it became this intergenerational experience in a way that I find that much of my other work does not, when it is housed in a specific space, in an indoor space specifically, where you can control who comes and goes.
It's really interesting. We have quite often done stuff in an urban space where we have split people into groups and made them go in different directions and then meet up at various points, and it is always terrifying. And and there are often moments, I think my favorite one ever was when we were doing the Odyssey, which Sarah was involved in a long time ago, and an actor suddenly came running up saying, the audience they realized that the actor they were supposed to be following was the siren, and they won't go with her, and they've gone rogue and they've gone off on their own. And we had to send another actor to run after them, go and find them and bring them back. I don't know where they thought they were going to end up going, but, you know, it's always an absolute crazy sort of mess of sort of timings and bits of paper on the floor going, well, if group one's there and group two's there, then how do they cross without seeing each other? But it is possible, but it is definitely much harder work than it is in the countryside, when, as Lynde says, there's just so much more space. It's so much easier. For me, the biggest difference is actually it's to do with what you do narratively, because as you say, in urban places, there are just so many people around, and people will get involved. And even if you've got a ticketed show where you have an audience following the whole thing, you will definitely have people who stop and watch some of it and who want to find out what's happening and who maybe want to interject at some points. And any script or any sort of narrative that you've got has to have space for that, because there's sort of nothing worse, I think, for immersive stuff than if people try and engage with you and you have an actor going, I can't talk to you because I'm doing this script now and I'm on the script and don't engage with me. So I think when we work with actors, we always try and make sure that they have A, the ability, and B, the space within the narrative to be able to deviate from it, talk to whoever's talking to them, engage with them in whatever way that is as the character, and then come back to what they're talking about and follow it through, which feels much more real. And actually, weirdly, when we've made stuff down here in much more rural landscapes, I missed that. I feel like audiences love it because it's clearly not planned, and it clearly shows that you're in the hands of skilled people who are orchestrating this experience for you. And audiences really like seeing someone skilled doing something unexpected, I think. But actually what we've ended up finding is that we end up sort of having like replacing the people with animals. So, if a herd of cows come up, or we were making a show down here a couple of years ago about Ondine, who's the source myth for the Little Mermaid. So the mermaid was sat by the side of this lake, asking the audience to go up the hill to find someone who might be able to help her get some legs and turn into a human. And these ducks came up and started quacking at her. And of course, what the actor did, because she's great, is start talking back to them and then going, oh my, why are you being so rude? And having a sort of funny conversation, trying to translate the ducks' conversation to the audience. And it became a really lovely thing. And on the nights the ducks didn't come, we were sad because it sort of added something. Like, why can't we make these ducks turn up at 7:30 every night? It's just not fair. But I think you could make something much more easily on script, I guess, in the countryside than you can in urban places. But actually, I'm not sure that you necessarily want to.
That's so interesting, this idea of like there's more possibility for intervention in an urban space and maybe less possibility, at least for human intervention, but maybe more animal intervention in a rural space. When I was working with Kas and Teatro Vivo as a writer on The Odyssey, which is quite a while ago, and it was the 11 years.
Oh my God. Okay.
Sorry. But it was like the most multifaceted process I've ever worked on in my life, because we had these audience in different groups and going to different places and different storylines, and then we'd swap storylines, and it was like there was a combination of like devised scenes and scripted scenes and singing, and it was amazing. And I remember we guys were talking about children, the intervention of children a little bit. I remember there were kids, or these like local kids on their roller skates who would just like kind of join us every night, and finally we were like, just be in the show. And so they were the gods, they were the Greek gods, which was a really unique experience, but also
extraordinary. They just would turn up every night at the same place, and we asked them to skate around the audience really, really fast and then point them in the direction that they had to go next. And they did it every night.
They were like 11 or 12 or something. They were kids. It was so great.
They also came up to the director and said, "Miss, are you Homer?" at one point, which I just thought was completely adorable because it's Homer's Odyssey. And then they came in and watched the end, so they sort of knew a bit more about what was happening. But those were not kids who really had any idea what was going on, except for that it was really fun to have a thing to do every night. It's great.
I am really curious to hear a little bit more from everyone about the nitty-gritty of your process, and how you work and how the companies that you work with work, and things like, we've already talked a bit about this, but like, what's the relationship between the audience and the performers and the landscape and the audience and the landscape? We're kind of talking about this triangle, and it'd be great where and when you can, if you could give us all like just little particular examples of like the kind of stuff you're doing and how that kind of operates.
I'll jump in. So this show that I referred to that we did in Central Park, it was the kickoff for a project called Climate Change Theater Action, which is something that we do every, you know about it, Lynde. It's something that we do every 2 years. We commission 50 playwrights from around the world to write short scripts that are about 5 minutes long about an aspect of the climate crisis based on a prompt. And then we take these 50 scripts and we make them available to anyone who wants to organize an event in their community within a certain time window, which is in the fall. And we kick off the season every year with an event, and that year was in Central Park. So what we did was we took 4 of these 50 scripts, and we presented them in 4 different areas in Central Park, and they represented, I think, 3 or 4 different countries. Some were very poetic, some were one person only monologues, and others were interactive. They required the audience to participate and had more than one performers. The one in particular that required the audience to participate was a play by a African playwright called named Elaya Kassam, and she used her traditional storytelling tradition to write the script. And in her tradition, the performer has to say, in English, it translates as story, and the audience has to respond, story come. So the storyteller is trying to conjure up the story, and if they get stuck, they need the help of the audience to say, the audience wants this story come. And doing that was amazing because the audience was invited to participate, so felt very much part of the show. And I think also, I'm not always comfortable when I'm invited to participate in a show, especially in a theater where I'm like, oh no, but my role is to just sit here and watch. But being outside, again, it seems like all the rules go away, and it's easier to ask for participation, and the audience, I think, it doesn't feel put on the spot in the same way. And in terms of the landscape, we because we were moving around, the performers stayed in one place, the audience moved around. We had blankets that we put on the ground, and people would just sit on the blankets and watch each show and then move to a different place. And one of the thread that we had also to link these performances together was we did a climate ribbon ritual, which is something that was created by artists a few years prior, and we just asked if we could borrow it. The audience wrote something that they were concerned about at the beginning of the show on a ribbon, and then they carried that ribbon with them. And at the end of the show, they wrote a hope on that same ribbon on the other side. And then they tied the ribbon to an arch, and we created sort of this tapestry of ribbons with everyone's hope. That was a tangible, like something tangible that was left from this performance. It's almost like, yes, I've gone through this. I have my hope now, and here's the proof of it.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah, I'm very inspired by that. And I'll share some practices and rituals from a group that actually did participate in a climate change theater action event in Manhattan many years ago, but it was very, very inspiring also. And so this ensemble called the Anthropologists, their whole motto is where art meets action. And so much of the social justice work that they do starts first with each of the artists. And so, for example, the climate change play that we did, This Sinking Island, about rising sea levels in Manhattan, also included a series of research that brought us each individually to make an eco pledge, as we playfully called it. And we were each going to find one thing to change about our daily life, about our habits, about our behavior that would help the planet and help our environment and create sustainability. And so mine was straws. I had mentioned straws earlier. And so I have in my home and everywhere with me reusable straws, and I don't use single-use plastics in the ways that I used to. Another person gave up meat entirely. And this was mainly to see, like, can we do it for the length of us participating in this project? And many of us, like myself, have just kept up with it because we proved we can. And it actually doesn't disrupt our lives in such a drastic way as we maybe once had assumed. And so even just by participating in these small individual ways, we were inciting a new movement in the life of this piece, where everywhere we go, and brought this piece to many different outside spaces, it became sort of the audience challenge to take up a single individual act. What is that thing? What is unique to you that you feel accomplishable, manageable, sustainable, things that you can already bring to the work? How can you participate in the larger message of the piece of theater that you are witnessing without actually being up on stage with us? Can you take it home with you? What is the thing you carry away with you? And because the nature of, as I've said before, was so intergenerational, what we found was that the younger audience members were so geared up to do these types of eco pledges. Were already on their way away from the performance, telling their parents, why are we doing it like this? We could do it a different way. And how excited they were to learn that they themselves can have agency in the sustainability of our world. I just don't think anyone before that moment, at least as I had observed, had framed it in a way that you too individually have a place in this movement and in the sustainability of our ecosystem and our ecology. And I think it was so exciting for me to see how audience and artists can sort of grapple with that together, but also share success stories, share challenges in that. There was so much to unpack from this piece that audience and artists alike really did sort of come together around understanding and changed behavior. So that was really fruitful for us as well.
I think I was going to talk about something else, but actually I think hearing you both talk about environmental issues and how we can, you know, interact and engage audiences around that obviously really huge thing that we're all thinking about a lot. I wanted to just talk about a project that we did last year that was actually a bit of a departure for us. I've talked before about how we often do these kind of big adventures where the audience are very much cast in that adventure. They'll get an email from a character when they book saying, you know, I'm Telemachus, please come to my house because my mother's going to marry one of these suitors and I really need you to help that not happen. Or, you know, thanks for coming to this reunion gig for this band, and you know, we won't refund you if there's bad behavior, because there always is. And so you're setting up the story and you're telling them what their role is a bit, and then they go off on a big adventure. But this show that we made last year was very different. We were commissioned by London Borough of Culture, which is, for those of you not in the UK, a kind of subsidised, although not as much as you'd imagine given the fuss they make about it, the arts festival, I guess, every year that one of the London boroughs is given some money to be London Borough of Culture, and then they're expected to run this huge programme of arts events over the whole year, which is kind of great, but also when you look at the reality of how much money they're given and the support to make that happen, it's maybe not as good as it sounds like it should be. But we were commissioned to be one of the artists of change when Lewisham got Borough of Culture, and the idea was that we'd sit in the climate resilience team at the council at Lewisham, so the local council, local government, for 6 months. And what we said we'd do, so our pitch to them was that we would observe, we would watch what they were doing, we would go out onto the streets of Lewisham and we would talk to people. We have some street theatre characters that can go out and engage with people, but in a kind of playful and fun way, and not just we're from the council with a clipboard and what do you think about climate change? And we would make a show that was in response to everything that we saw and heard. So by month 5, when we hadn't made the show yet, there were a lot of people getting very fraught about this because they wanted us to know what it was going to be about. And we were saying, well, we don't know, because until we've got all those responses in, we can't tell you. And we'll get into the rehearsal room and look at everything that we've gathered, and then we'll make a show. And so what we ended up making was a sort of surprisingly, well, not surprisingly, but it was not what I thought it would be. It was really quite a political piece, because what we heard we spoke to something like 5,000 people, and what we heard was, we know that climate change is a problem. We're either really concerned in doing stuff, or we're not doing stuff because we don't have time, money, energy to devote to it. But we don't see why we should when the government aren't doing anything. And the government needs to change. What's the point of me recycling a yogurt pot if at a governmental level they're going to allow planners to build really environmentally disastrous new buildings, or not stop people from driving polluting cars, or not subsidise the railways and public transport so people don't have any other way of getting around, all of that sort of stuff. So we ended up making this kind of, hear the people of Lewisham, this is our shout to government, is what we want you to do. And we performed it in 19 venues around the borough, and then we performed it in the council chamber to the council, which was kind of amazing. And we had a chorus of local people with us, and they all hear them sort of shouting this protest song at the end of the piece, with all these councillors having to say, my goodness. At the same time, at the end of each performance, we'd had the show had been performed on this giant floor map of Lewisham, and we'd asked people to write in their little bit of Lewisham what they'd like to see, the changes they'd like to see, the environmental changes they'd like to see. And so each individual councillor could come and look at their little bit of the borough and see what the people in their bit of the borough wanted them to do. And it was just such a direct way of people being able to talk to each other that just doesn't usually happen. Like, we went into the hospital and talked to people who were in hospital. We went into housing estates, we went into Millwall Football Club. We went into places where those people are not talking about climate concerns or having their voices heard on it. And then we went and performed it at the Ocean People's Day to the Mayor of London, and they came up with a climate manifesto, which was a list of demands of what they wanted him to do. And it honestly just felt like the most empowering thing, to be this kind of channel for thousands of people's voices who wouldn't normally get heard, but we were able to amplify those voices as a theatre company. And all the performances were free. So it just hit, a lot of people that wouldn't normally get reached. And actually, I think it was really interesting, because people, the sort of powers that be, did take it on board, and there's a lot of talk, and I've spoken at a lot of panels recently about the project and how governments, governmental organisations and the public sector here can collaborate with artists to reach people that are just not reachable for them through the normal channels. And for me, that feels like a really amazing development, and something that should be shouted about more, because no one wants to answer a council person with a clipboard asking them what they think about climate change. They sort of like veer around them to avoid, but they'll chat to a theatre company who are making a show about it, because it's fun, more interesting.
That's an
Sorry,
amazing.
I talked for ages there, but it was a mad project.
No, that's amazing. That's a wonderful story. That feels really it feels so kind of inspiring, because I think so many of us want our theater to make political change, make social change, and that seems like such a excellent example of how you can, as Melanie says in the comments, it's a fantastic intersection of authentic political polling, art, and action.
Yeah. It was fascinating, actually. I thought we'd get in trouble. I thought when they saw the show, they'd go, "Oh, we didn't want you to make this. We want, not actually anything holding anyone to account." But they were completely brilliant. I mean, and to be fair, Lewisham Council itself is a left wing, it's a Labour council, so it's the sort of left wing party here. So they're probably on a national level as fed up as we are with what's going on with our national government. But there was absolutely a genuine, we can't just keep telling people where their local recycling places are if we don't feel like we're stepping up and doing something more substantial. It's really interesting. Great. Yeah, making good trouble. Exactly.
I had all these questions, but you guys have been so amazing. You've answered so many. I had a question about climate change and the role of climate change in the work, and everyone's talked about it. And I was going to ask, why is this, why is it important to make environmental theater? But you're answering that as you go along. I guess in the last sort of 12 or 15 minutes or so, we have for another question before we turn it over to the audience. Is there anything else you'd like to kind of bring up or talk about, or just mention, before we turn to the audience?
Yeah, I think with this kind of work, we have the opportunity to rethink how we tell stories. And Kas mentioned whose voice is being heard. That's certainly one consideration, but also how and going outside maybe is another way to help that. But how do we sort of try to show that there are a lot of stuff that can be done outside of the main systems, how can we tell stories that try to counter what we have received from colonialism or inflicted from colonialism? How can we tell stories that try to maybe highlight the problems of class and patriarchy, and certainly going outside and addressing the climate crisis are an entry point into those stories, because the climate crisis is very much a symptom of these bigger systems that have gone awry. And so I've been very interested in what do our new stories need to do. There's this wonderful researcher in Canada named David Maggs who put out a report last year called The Art and the World After This. And his call to artists is to re-author the world. That's how he says it, which is to rethink who we are in the world and how we want to go forward, and what are the values we need to embrace in order to do that. So I think that's still a very important part of the addressing the environment and the climate crisis, and addressing all of the other crises that we are facing in this moment.
I think it's really tricky as well, because I think coming off the back of COVID, certainly here, we found that audiences are feeling slightly sort of holding the weight of all of that, and finding it maybe hard to hear some things because actually just they're already stressed and worried about everything, and it just becomes very weighty. So I think what we've talked about a lot in the last year is, tackling these issues is super important, and we want to keep doing that, but everything we make has got to be extremely good fun. First and foremost, because people just will not engage if it's not first and foremost a really enjoyable experience for them. And for me, that's a really important thing to bear in mind when we're trying to make work that creates change, I guess, on some level, is that we're also here to bring joy to people and not make them feel worse about a really difficult period of time that we seem to find themselves in. So and I think it's quite a difficult line to tread to do both those things, but I think it is possible. I think we always really try to do that. It is possible. It's hard.
Yeah, I totally agree with that as well. And I think that for me, it was sort of always about meeting people where they were, not telling them you have to act a certain way or dress a certain way or have a certain amount of money to experience this message, this piece of art that we are all going to share and experience together, and it's going to change us in different ways. And I think, Kas, to what you were just saying about sort of the onus of holding all of it, like it has always sort of been that macro and micro pulse, where we do have to understand that we are part of a larger system that is at work always, but that we have agency over our own lives and our own individual choices, and understand that I believe it does matter, the choices we make on a daily basis to keep continuing movement forward and not bring us regressing back into a time when people really didn't engage in any type of sustainability practice or rituals towards eco-justice. And I think it was something that, Chantal, you were just saying, just about understanding the system and like bringing people together to share an experience, I think with laughter even, and joy has often been the best way to open people's eyes to things that are happening.
Yeah.
It feels like as everyone was talking, I was thinking about, at least in the UK where I've been based for many years, the kind of journey of environmental and site-specific, site-responsive theater from being like a cool thing that people did because it was it was cheaper, it was interesting, or it was sort of fun or creative, and now more and more it's becoming more political and more about climate change and more about drawing attention to these things. And there does seem to be something we're talking about right now of the links between disrupting the system, disrupting the politics, disrupting kind of our normal patterns of everyday life, literally, with this work that pops up in unexpected places, whether it's in the middle of the city or out in field in the countryside. There's sort of an intention of political disruption that comes with the practice, which is exciting. And so I think that's an exciting note to end the discussion on, but I would love to turn it over to our fantastic audience. If anyone has any questions, you're welcome to turn your camera back on if you would like. You can raise your hand. You can put your question in the chat. We already have one from Sarah Friedman.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much. It's super fascinating to listen to. Kaz, when you were talking about the project in Lewisam, I was reminded of reading about welfare states projects in the 80s and early 90s doing large-scale work. So part of my question is, as a person at a university, and at a university that has just revamped its set of academic programs so that we now have a umbrella program department, not quite a department, called Environmental Sciences and Studies, in which there are going to be three major tracks. One which is the environmental sciences track, one which is called Environmental Policy and Decision Making, which has been a track we've almost always had because we didn't always have the lab options for full environmental science, and one that we're calling Earth, which is Environmental Arts and Humanities. And which has been really vigorously and beautifully designed by a bunch of us collaborating across the arts and humanities. And here I have to credit having worked with Theresa May as like making my ability to participate in this as full. And Chantal, I think you have worked with Theresa before. So I know that I'm going to design a class pretty soon for the Earth major that will think about theater and environment, really just the topic of your panel. Maybe I will just name it the topic of your panel. And I'm thinking about your work, and I'm thinking about guest artists, and I'm also thinking about what you all panelists, if you would even name just one or two what you think of as antecedents or types of work that you are inspired by, but also maybe other work in this realm that I might not have been hearing about lately or that you love that's current, because I'm just making a huge list of things to draw on as I design that class. Thank you.
So the question is sorry, can you just rephrase the question so it's super clear? It's asking them for recommendations of this kind?
Yeah, I was hoping for both something that you turn to for inspiration and something that sort of looking back, and something that looking forward or looking current around you that you also love other people's work.
Okay, so inspiration, either past, present, future.
Yeah.
I think I probably have one that's the same for both, actually. Which is, there's a company here, I don't know if you know them, called Wild Works, but they made work in the West Country a long time. They've been going for quite a long time now, before us for sure. And when I was a very early stage actress, I was so very excited by the work they were making. Just look them up and see what they do. They made extremely beautiful work outdoors and in unusual spaces. And the other company that inspires me enormously today, a Slunglow, who are a company, they're run by a chap called Alan Lane, who's just completely brilliant, and they're based in Leeds, and they work out of one of the most difficult deprived bits of Leeds, which is a city in the north of England, not a particularly rich city in the north of England, and they have a building there that is still a working men's club, and they've sort of kept the working men's club going by inhabiting it, and they have done such extraordinary work of showing very avant-garde theatre to old guys from Leeds who used to only go in for a pint on a Tuesday night, or the whole way through COVID, they made amazing stuff in their car park. They also turned into a distribution centre where they were like distributing food parcels and all this sort of stuff to the local community. Like they are absolutely 100% embedded in that bit of Leeds, and the work they make goes out onto the streets, and they sort of collaborate very finely with the people that they are sort of surrounded by, and I think what he does is so inspirational. But to the two extremes, I mean, they're working in a very urban space and Wildworks work in a very rural one, but they both make really brilliant and beautiful stuff.
Celie Questa says Slonglow's founder helped publish a book recently. I have this book sitting on my shelf right now because someone sent it to me. It is called The Club on the Edge of Town, and it's called Allen Lane. I'll put it in the chat.
Although, as I was just saying this, I had a horrible feeling that about a week ago, and I haven't had time to look at it, I saw a thing saying that they're having a real problem with the trustees of the building, so it might all be about to fall apart. So, but I'm sitting here telling you how wonderful it is, but I'm sure if that is the case, they'll find somewhere else to be.
Chantal and Lynde, inspirations.
Yeah, I'm sure you know this book, Sarah, The Great Derangement by Amitav Ghosh. Yeah, wonderful. And then for a theater company, I was going to offer Mondo Bizarro, and they're based in New Orleans in Louisiana. I haven't seen their work directly, but I've just heard of it, and I've heard Nick Sly, who is part of that company, speak, and they do a lot of work outside with communities. And of course, what's very poignant about what they do is that they know that city is going, they know that it's not however long it's going to take. They're trying to help people come to terms with the grief that is associated with their home that are going to disappear. So if you look them up, they do wonderful work.
Can you tell me the name again? I'll put the link in the chat.
Yeah, Mondo Bizarro.
Mondo Bizarro.
2 words. Yeah, and 2 Z in Bizarro.
Great, thank you. I'll search the link and put it in the chat. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in just to share, because it's hard for me to identify sort of even like pieces of literature. I found that I have been the most inspired over the past few years by just the responsiveness, and it has come mostly from individual artists inciting action, maybe within organizations and institutions. But I'm thinking, for example, of the theaters in the US while the civil unrest was happening around the murder of George Floyd, how many opened their doors during the height of COVID to give bottles of water. And obviously single-use plastics are not the thing that we're highlighting in this moment, but I'm just saying, like, there's a responsiveness to the things that's happening outside of your space. And when you step outside of your space to see what the need is, meeting the need where it is, what you see, and being responsive to it. I will say that the archive that I was privy to around climate change theater action is incredible. These are individual playwrights fully capturing and articulating the world they see around them and how they see it evolving. I think I am still deeply inspired by all of the plays that I have read through climate change theater action, and even individual playwrights that I have worked with. Melissa Machido runs The Anthropologists, which is an ensemble devising company in New York, who very much works around art and action, very much uses dramaturgy deep into their social justice work.
Could you say that name again?
Yes, The Anthropologists. I can also throw a link in the chat. And yeah, and I'll just say another playwright's name, Jessica Kokoska, wrote a play with music called Wildfire that addressed the East Troublesome Fire of Colorado in 2020 and was deeply embedded in sort of the eco-justice of that event. And so, yeah, those are just some things that inspire me. Thanks, Sarah, for your question.
Wonder, that was great. That's so interesting. I feel like we should create a sort of shared document with all these wonderful names and books and theater companies and plays. Hannah, you've had your hand up for a little while now.
Yes, it's not very hard when it's a digital hand. So I just on Sarah's question, my go-to book for this is Lucy Neal's Playing for Time, Making Art as if the World Mattered. it's like a bit of a tome, but it's just wonderful. So that's my tip. Now, my question to you all is, because I'm currently engaged with 2 bids of this kind of things that are coming out now, a little bit like what Kas was talking about, which are where sort of local governments and governments are turning to the artists to help with the message, help with engagement and all of those kind of things. So one is very urban and one is in the countryside. But the difference between the two is that one is like 18 months and the other one is 3 years. And I'm thinking about this a lot, dramaturgically, about, as you were talking about earlier, about change, about how to address and help with the change, and how to also be able to go from the fears and the anxiety people have around climate to turn it into something more hopeful, active. So my question is around timeline. What in your experience between the 3 of you, what is an ideal timeline to engage with people?
So what's an ideal timeline for making a show, making an environmental
making a show? Because these projects are not making a show necessarily. They are a mix of things, but you are also involving then, as with the Lewisham example, local council, scientists, conservationists.
So putting together a project that can be shared.
Yes, so but my interest in this is the dramaturgical journey of that change, of creating, allowing for the different stages of the change to happen. And I'm just interested in the experience that the 3 speakers have in what feels like a good arc.
I guess the project that I was talking about happened over 6 months. And it felt quick. It felt really quick. I think we'd have liked more time if we could have had it. That said, I think the benefit of doing things quickly is that you sort of build up a bit of a head of steam, and that's can be quite useful. And I think you can go too far the other way and takes too long, and then people drop off or lose interest or life takes over, and people who were very engaged and up for it and into it at the beginning may become less so because they just can't continue that commitment for a long period of time. So I guess it's hard to say without knowing what sort of commitment you're going to be asking for from people, or what you're wanting, how you're wanting them to engage. Because for me, the thing that's more useful is to have time at the beginning to embed yourself in a community so that people trust you, recognize you, know your face, and are curious about what you're doing. To have more time to do that would be really useful. But I think once you're going, it's sometimes can be better to be quite, to be quite present for a period of time and drag that energy of people with you than to sort of meet less regular or do stuff less regularly and then it will peter out, people move or carrying responsibility change or whatever that might be, I guess.
That's really helpful. Yeah,
I'll say that I've always worked in a way that, and my collaborators would all probably agree, that we fill the time that we have, right? So if we have 3 years, we'll fill 3 years. If we have 6 months, we'll fill 6 months. But it's sort of those moments of what is the goal and the measures of success that you build. And I think that creating touch points or markers throughout a process with audience, with artists, building those bridges, so it's not we come together at the beginning and then we come together at the end, and where were we all throughout the process of building. And I found that for me with audience engagement, it was often about sort of how do we create tangential or satellite events or participation opportunities so that the messaging of the work is still present, even if the work itself isn't really ready to be shared yet. And clothing swaps, other types of eco-friendly events. We did do a lot with the younger generations because we knew this would be an intergenerational experience. We wanted to make sure that we understood how young people were engaging with us before we start building things. So there were a lot of those markers built in. But ultimately, once we knew what our end date was, we knew we had to build in some community touch points that went along with the building of the art in tandem with it, and ultimately informed how we moved forward with creating the art, because we were learning so much outside of the rehearsal rooms and outside of our rehearsal time.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much. It's super interesting stuff about embedding the work, whether you can parachute in or not. Probably not ideal to parachute in, and maybe this sort of work is maybe you don't spend so much time and money on, say, sets or costumes, but you might be spending more time in getting to know the community and the area and the landscape. Fiona, yes, we'll go with Fiona.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, hello. I just wanted to quickly make a few responses and then ask a question, if that's all right. I'm going to read them because I've been making them as you go along, so I'll be as tight as I can be. So really, really lovely to hear about all these different projects, and it really reminded me about the ecological implications of the dramaturgy within this work. It kind of heightened that for me, listening to what you've been saying. And it made me think, because I've worked as a dramaturg on site-specific projects in New Zealand and Australia, and it made me think about several questions that have been really important in that practice. First of all, starting sort of from the archaeology of the land, kind of drawing on Mike Pearson's work in Britain, and a question that's about how does the past speak to the present and the future, and the ecological and post-colonial significance of that. And then when I was listening to you talking about, you know, the balance between laughing and asking questions, I was thinking, you know, what's the balance between hope and fear within this work, and the importance of joy as well within the practice. And then how does the work move, and how does it move the audience? How do they know how to move? That's been a really big thing when I've been working on these projects. And then drawing upon Kathy Turner's work with Rights and Sites, you know, what are the porous possibilities within these projects? And I have actually talked to, you know, about that before, but I think it's, sorry, I'll be a second, someone's talking to me. But I think it's always unknown when you're looking at the porous possibilities, but you have to try and think about that when you're actually working on these projects. And then finally, I'm really interested in what this work does to you as a performance maker. I think it makes you feel and think in new ways. And so I'm really interested to ask that question. What does this work do to you as a performance maker, and how does it make you think differently?
For the sake of efficiency, because there's a question in there that links up with Giselle's question in the chat box, I'm gonna bring the two together. So she says, "Hello everyone. I hope it's okay to type a question." She's lost her voice. How do legacies of colonialism, one of the links between our landscapes, engage your dramaturgical exploration? How are the ghosts of history embedded in the layers of narratives you create? And further, how do audiences with different identities experience these works? Some spaces are inaccessible, deemed dangerous or risky, maybe not so easy to explore. So I'm going to bring those two together, because we have like sort of 15, 20-ish minutes left. But if there's, so we'll think about that question, but also this other question of how does making this work make you feel? Let's we can answer that as well. And then we will get to Mark. Okay.
That's a lot of question all in one go.
So maybe for now, let's focus on the one about histories and colonialism and landscapes and ghosts. Maybe we can focus on that.
It's a very strange thing, because actually we're making a show, we're touring a little show at the moment. That's a show that tours rural pubs, which is again a very specific landscape, I suppose, and it is essentially a story to encourage people to think about who might have inhabited that seat in the pub before them. And obviously a lot of rural pubs in the UK are maybe like 200, 300, 400 years old and have been operating as inns for a very long time. So ghosts come up a lot. And what's been really interesting to me is that everybody knows those stories. Like when we go to those places, people at the end of the show are always wanting to tell us about the real life ghosts of the place that we've just performed. So the history kind of has ended up permeating the show a lot, and we have ended up leaving space to, if we know a real genuine story of that place before we perform in it, we weave that into the story, because I think that matters, right? People actually are very interested in connecting with the past and what has happened in a place. And I think there's a really interesting, tough kind of again line to walk when we talk about colonialism and things that have happened in the past that we want to acknowledge potentially. For me, there's always a battle between never wanting to ignore things and never wanting to not to acknowledge, but also not wanting to allow the work to be dominated by political things that maybe don't aid the work. So I guess what we try to do is be quite light touch about it, and make sure that we're acknowledging without, again, making it weighty in some way. It's tough, it's a tough thing. On the other points, accessibility is a really interesting thing that we haven't talked about at all. We always put in every single budget room for accessibility stewards who are there specifically. They are only there to individually escort anybody with access needs. We ask people to contact us before a show, and we will literally plan a bespoke route for anybody who has access needs, because you know everybody with access needs has slightly different access needs, and we don't want to say, well, you're in a, you know, you have this, so therefore you've got this step thing that you have to do instead or whatever, and we will always try and find a way for anyone with access requirements to have an absolutely full experience, and sometimes a better experience than people who don't have access requirements, because sometimes they have a specific actor assigned to them to give them a, you know, one-to-one thing as they go on a slightly different route. There was one other question. Oh, how does it make you feel? As a performer, this sort of work brings me so much more joy than traditional acting, that now when I work on a normal show, I just feel that something's missing, and that thing is genuine engagement with the audience that I am performing for and with, and that for me is often more interesting than performing just with other actors. I'll shut up now. We've only got 15 minutes left.
Chantal or Lynde?
Yeah, so I'm not a performer, but how it makes me feel as a playwright and theater maker is, it's for me, it's the meaningfulness of engaging with a story, you know, that is dominating our time, the story of the climate crisis and how we need to move forward. The joy of going very deeply into subject matter. I know for performers I have worked with that they often come out changed. Like Lynde mentioned, you know, they end up making personal choices just as part of the learning what we're working on, and they carry that even after the performance is over. I often think actually that in the theater making process, it is the performers who get the most out of the work, because the audience only experiences it once, but the performers are thinking deeply about it for a number of weeks usually. And in terms of histories, I'm interested in deep time as a way to, I guess, put the human species into a different, look at us from a different perspective. We've only been here a short amount of time compared to the trajectory of the Earth itself. And I try to bring this sensibility in different things that I do, either in my own writing or in some of the shows that we put together. This show that I mentioned in Central Park, we, as a welcome, before we went on the walk, we talked a little bit about the indigenous population who used to live on the island, and the African American villages that were where Central Park sits right now. So as Kas said, it was fairly light touch. It was a welcome, and just acknowledging that there were, before that there was Central Park, there were other people here and other landscapes, but it felt important to mention it and to put what we were doing in the context of this bigger history.
Yeah, and I'll very quickly just jump in to add that I think acknowledgement is exactly that. And for me, acknowledgement has changed me in a way of deeper understanding. So the piece that I was referencing throughout this panel definitely focused on climate refugees, and this idea that a lack of resources, what creates refugees and displacement and seeking new place, is something that we all may at one point have to contend with as the earth gets smaller and as seas rise and natural disasters continue. And I think that this idea of what does it mean to be a displaced person, and what does it mean to lose place, and sense of understanding of where you sit in the land and who has been displaced from the land you sit on now, and who will be the next to be displaced, I think is something that when I think of land and sky and water, and I think of myself in relationship to these elements, I think of that. I think of sense of place. And that's something that I personally take into what I consider a liberation practice, the decolonizing of one's own world in the way that I think can be affected on an individual level. But I think systemically, the reason I join ensembles and groups of other collaborators and theater artists, and I'm not just painting a painting alone in my room, and I come together with other artists, is to have that collective understanding, is to have a shared vision of a future that is sustainable. And that's something that I think, to answer the other question that's in the chat, handle ethical concerns. Those concerns are debated hotly and brought into and unpacked with other artists in a way that I feel like every project has its unique set of ethical concerns that must also be deeply considered. And so I would say they are as individually addressed as they come up in the individual pieces we create. But that's, I know we only have 10 minutes left.
A very quick observation, that something that's interesting to me is there's this idea of land acknowledgement, which happens on sort of widely acknowledged colonized land. So North and South America and Australia and South Africa, New Zealand, etc. But we don't really do land acknowledgement in the UK. I don't know anyone who does it in Europe, but there's something interesting. There's something we can all kind of learn from and understand, this idea of displacement of people, because there certainly have been people who have been displaced in the UK, and there are being displaced now, and in London, where I am based, it's happening constantly. There's this crazy thing of schools are shutting down all over the city because people can't afford to have kids in the city anymore, and they're being physically kind of displaced. There's a displacement of people living in social housing. There's the displacement of recently Afghani refugees who were living in London, forcibly displaced up to the north. So it's really interesting in terms of this practice, displacement, and who owns the land, and can you own land, and how that relates to climate change. Anyway, it's fascinating. Mark, thank you for being patient.
Oh, you're still muted, Mark.
First, I think it's wonderful in the midst of everything that we are dealing with in our society right now, that to come here today and celebrate successes. I think this is fantastic. I want to isolate two things, and there were many things to celebrate. I thought it was fantastic to hear the notion of the environment as an extra collaborator, this idea of creating a channel for voices that aren't normally heard and amplifying them. I think this is tremendous. We mustn't not go away and lose that. And also, again, not isolating, not amplifying any one thing said, but this whole notion of creating events that allow for the possibility of audience challenges. How do you give audiences the opportunity to make them feel like they can participate and walk away with that? I think it's tremendously important. I don't know when it was, it doesn't matter. Don't mean to go into deep history, Mark Bly's deep history, but I've worked at 6-7 theaters across the country over the last 40 years. And one of the things I learned very quickly, by very quickly, I mean 10 years, is that instead of creating a sense of them and me, bipartisan things, is to find a way of, in the midst of turmoil, of locating a way of making the other people, giving them a chance to be a hero, giving them a chance to be a hero as well, and being secure enough in my own beliefs that I can give them a chance to do that. We have to remember that instead of backing up and saying, you don't understand. And that's a big problem we have in this country. And today I heard, and this is how I measure success, that we're capable of doing that. That's something I heard today. Now, I've said something very positive. I hope I can nail this in 6 minutes. This weekend, I went down to see the work of an old collaborator, Moses Kaufman, that I worked with for 4.5 years on 33 variations around the country, and a former student of mine, Ken Lin, on a play called Exclusion, that the starting point was the Chinese Exclusion Act. Moses Kaufman's play, Here There Are Blueberries, was about the discovery of a Nazi album. You need to read up on it if you get a chance to see it, either in DC or in New York next year at New York Theater Workshop.
Just going to flag very quickly. We have 5 minutes left. So if you want a response from anyone, we've got 5 minutes.
Half hour ago, had my thing in the chat and was ignored. So here we go. The point being that when I went down there, I had not been there for 9 years. The last time I was there was working on Mother Courage with Molly and with Kathleen Turner. And 9 years ago, all there was this new theater that I'd helped to build, raise $135 million for. And I remember thinking, this looks like the Starship Enterprise had crashed. This magnificent state-of-the-art building. And still on the wharf, there was just very, very few restaurants. And you could still see all the gorgeous sailboats. I had not gone back in 9 years, and I went there, and you can't see the sailboats. It's all restaurants. This Starship Enterprise, there's now 20, 30 Starship restaurant hotel things. When we created that theater there, we thought that was going to be the bridgehead for redevelopment of that area, which had fallen into disrepair badly. We thought this is going to help that area. Our success, the Arena Stage's success, has transformed that area into something awful now, into something else. And the Arena Stage, now you can barely find it. You can find all of those ugly hotels. You can barely find the sailboats. You can barely find the gorgeous little fish market. But the success of that theater has somehow transformed that area into something like this wharf mall from hell, and an urban environmental hell. It's an interesting phenomenon that I have not seen anyplace else. And it's, again, counters what I've just said, celebration of what you've said. But it disturbed me greatly that that success of an amazing theater, and it's doing incredible work, somehow that bridgehead, developers said, oh, now we're going to take advantage of this. All of these multi-billionaires moved right in and transformed.
Can I respond to that in the last couple of minutes?
Yes, we have 2 minutes. Yes,
2 minutes.
please. I would like everyone to please respond.
That has absolutely, and actually linking into the question about ethical concerns, for me, it's one of the biggest ones. And it's absolutely something we've dealt with. We started working in Deptford, which is an extremely rundown bit of Lewisham in London. It is now very gentrified. And there was a point when that gentrification process was starting to happen, when we found we were being used, video of us, an image of us was being used on developer marketing materials, or come and move to Deptford, look how Gigi it is now. And we very rigorously make them cease and desist and take any reference to us off their materials, because obviously we did not want to be associated with that. And I think it's something we have to be, as artists, really aware of.
Yeah.
It is not, however, our fault. We can't say we won't go to rundown areas because because otherwise it might make them too nice and then people will get priced out. It isn't our fault. And if we work in a really authentic way with the people who live in those areas and bring improvements and joy to their lives, I think we have to be very wary and mindful and make sure we are not getting into bed with the developers and the wrong people and not letting them use us in any way that we can prevent. But I feel like it doesn't also help to not go and work in those places, So I think we just have to keep our eyes open to what other people might be using our work for.
I'm just going to interrupt so Chantal and Lynde can have a chance to respond to all of this. It's really interesting. So just, if you guys have anything you'd like to jump in and say to this, like landscape and gentrification and environment and relationship between the arts and gentrification, if you have anything. Or anything, actually, this last question, we can tie into this final question of how do you handle ethical concerns? And we're at time, so if anyone needs to leave, you can absolutely leave. But if anyone has a last thing to say, absolutely share it.
Yeah, I'll just jump in really quickly to say that I do agree with Kas about the authentic integration into a community. I think it is slow moving. I don't think you can just sort of pop up and put up a building and say well, we're part of it now. I think it's about asking the community, what are the needs? It's about identifying those needs and being responsive in a way that isn't assumptive or prescriptive, because you know better because you have seen outside this space. And I think that the folks who live there are the ones to do the communicating about what those needs are, and it is the artist's role to respond and provide support for the forward movement of whatever that community's needs are. Thanks.
I don't have much to add other than maybe say that I have mixed feelings sometimes about going into communities, just because at least in the US, there seems to be a big push from funders to send arts organizations into communities. And and that's great. But sometimes I think, what if the funding was provided to the community itself, for them to decide what they need and what they want, and then for them to go look for the organizations that they would like to partner with. So I think there's definitely goods and bads, and it's a decision that has to be maybe evaluated every time we do it.
That's a beautiful note to end on. Thank you very much. Thank you all so much for your brilliant words of wisdom and your experiences and your very nuanced discussion. That was really, really fantastic. So a virtual round of applause for Chantal and Lynde and Kas, and also the lovely people, some of whom are here, some of whom are not, from the DN who helped put this together. And thank you all so much for coming. If anybody, like, obviously, you know, Lynde and Kas and Chantal, you're welcome. If anyone has any questions, wants to see your work, contact you, you're welcome to put, you know, your website or your email or whatever in the chat. And if you don't want to, you absolutely don't have to do that. So that is open. Yes, wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your morning, day, or evening.
Thank you, Sarah. Wonderful having a conversation with you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Gonna go and put my daughter to bed.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Goodbye.